least, Roger is going to take us into the rich areas and the rich neighborhoods. So, yes, it is. I hope it doesn't keep giving me that. Oh, we handle it.
Okay, I'll be quick because you all want your dinner. I'm going to take you to a very different space. I'm going to talk about beyond super gentrification. I'm going to talk about, and it's going to be very sorry for you to feel any sympathy here, I should say. I'm going to talk about the displacement of the merely wealthy by the plutocratic Uber wealth. You've probably seen this diagram from Oxfam. In 2010, there were 388 identifiable individuals in the world who owned as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the whole planet. That's now 62. Into the bus. 62 people controlling as much wealth as 50% of the poorest people on the planet. Concentration of wealth on a scale unheard of. In 2014, I'm waiting for the new figures any day now, there were 14.3 high net worth individuals across the world, and that was up from 8.6 in 2008. The time of the financial crash. So since 2008, we've seen an increase of some 70% in just 6 years. Not a recession, a robbery, essentially. Here's a very detailed geodemographic map of London. Because these people have to live somewhere, and I'm interested in the impact of this huge increase in concentration of wealth across the globe and about where those people reside. They often reside in many places. But what I want to suggest to you is that if you actually are interested in locality and neighbourhood and the sorts of areas that you've been focusing on, some really interesting things happening in some of the core areas of affluent London. And I'm going to suggest something quite outrageous. It is that some very, very, very wealthy people are themselves being displaced, both in terms of their cultural sensibility, but often also in terms of their ability to actually buy into the areas which they feel are their own, and they're being displaced by new global money. So of this 14.6 million high net worth individuals, we have about 550,000 of them in the UK. Most of them live in London. About 500,000 live in London and its environs, and they live in places like this. This is a 5-bedroom flat for sale in One Hyde Park. So if you've got a spare £68 million, you could buy that for the few trips that you have down to London, to the theatre. And I say that half jokingly, but these properties are also often not occupied for very long periods of time. Now, we've been doing some research the last few years, myself, Roland Atkinson, Mike Savage, Caroline Knowles, Tim Butler, to try and see if we could apply some of the methodologies that we developed in terms of studying the middle class to the upper classes, or to the uber upper classes. And it really relates to some interesting theoretical ideas about the nature of class analysis. Because often when you look at literature, for instance, on gentrification, it's all about the displacement of the working class by the middle class. And yet when you talk about super gentrification, of course, it's not the displacement of the working classes, it's the displacement of one fraction of the upper classes by another fraction of the upper classes. So it really relates to a more nuanced, more granular sense of differentiation amongst the wealthy. And this is no small matter. We talk about the 1%, but the Gini coefficient for the 1% is much greater than the Gini coefficient for the 99%. Patterns of inequality amongst the most wealthy is greater than patterns of inequality amongst the rest of us. And that's really very, very important, because it's these quite massive gradations in wealth that are important. So it's about no longer looking at big classes, it's about looking at kind of micro classes, to use that terminology by Whedon and Grutsky. So what we've done is we've gone to an odd kind of source of data. We've gone to the commercial sector. We've gone to Big Bad Experian, and we've been using their geodemographic classifications to try and socially, spatially map out these very kind of nuanced differences. And we've been interested in trying to map out this group here, what they call in marketing parlance the alpha territory, which they break down into 4 groups: global power brokers, voice of authority, business class, serious money. Different sorts of wealth, derived from different sorts of areas. So this is the alpha territory. That's Piers and Imogen, who, because we have a very clear geography of naming practice in relation to the cultural differentiation between these groups. The alpha territory is split into 4. Global power brokers, the wealthiest, who I'll return to in a moment, that's Christiane and Eleanor. Voices of Authority, these are the people I'm going to be talking about in a minute, most of whom live in Highgate and Hampstead. Andreas and Catherine. Business Class, Alistair, Rosalind, Jack and Charlotte. Serious Money, Timothy and Francesca. Now this is a map which maps out the Alpha territory. It's a Danny Dorling type diagram. If you draw the landmass of Britain, it looks like this. If you draw it in proportion to where the Alpha territory live, Newcastle doesn't seem to exist anymore. This shows the cognitive geography for the super wealthy is London and the South East, and very, very particular bits of London in particular. 95% of these people live within about 5 miles of each other around the great parks in London. Now we've been looking at a number of these Alpha territories over the last 2 years. Been doing interviews, ethnographic observations, statistical work to try and understand the quite colossal mechanisms of social change that are happening in places like Chelsea and Kensington, Holland Park, Notting Hill, and the area that I thought I'd just focus on is an area I'm particularly interested in, Highgate Village, not least because this is long been the domain of the wealthy, but the wealthy with liberal opinion. It's the place of poets and academics and philosophers and architects and designers, and oh god, they're really pissed off because this is the geographic mapping of the area, and whereas maybe even 20 years ago you could still buy a nice Victorian or Edwardian house for £500,000, 750,000 quid. If you were a barrister or you were an architect, making a good living, and you could go to lots of reclamation yards, and you could restore it, and you could aestheticize it in terms of that classic kind of middle class North London gentrification. You can't do that anymore because those properties are now 5, 6, 7 million pounds. The population moving into those neighbourhoods is completely different in terms of their source of capital, but also in terms of the prevailing aesthetic. Because what they find is that they no longer want to prevail the specificity of the Victoriana or the Edwardian, or even with a modernist. They just want to rip it to shreds, to put in wooden floors, white walls, security, basements, space, defensiveness, and they don't want anything to do with being in Highgate. They don't want to go to the church or to the Highgate Scientific and Literary Institute, or even really to walk the dog on the heath. They're there because they can buy a property in London which they can then expand and generate space within. So quite interesting forms of displacement and conflict within Highgate. You'll know Highgate, I'm sure. I won't go through the history of it. But this notion of liberal radical opinion, not only is Marx buried in the cemetery, so is Malcolm McLaren, the manager of the Sex Pistols. So it's always had this particular kind of radical, liberal aesthetic that is not what the people who are now moving into are buying into. Tariq Ali could afford to buy that house in the 1970s, which he's now sold for £6.6 million. He clearly could not, or someone of his equivalent. I don't know who's the equivalent. Owen Jones couldn't afford to buy that house. And of course, Highgate was also, and Hampstead was also the place where we built these huge houses along the ridge. Wittenhurst, Kenwood, which was given to the state, Athlone House. I just want to focus a little bit on Wittenhurst, because Wittenhurst, when it was first built, was the second largest residential property in the UK after Buckingham Palace. And it was occupied, and it was lived in until maybe about the 1920s, I think, when all of these houses were no longer sustainable by single families, where they moved into institutional use. And various things around kind of hotels and hospitals and schools and such like. What's interesting, if you compare 1914 with 2014, as Piketty asked us to do, is that these properties are now coming back into single ownership. There are now people who can afford to buy those properties, and indeed they do buy those properties. And these are the people the great and the good of Highgate, to take this example, who, you know, after they retire, move into High Point, where the kind of the aesthetics of life within this particular urban village is being quite fundamentally changed, because the person who bought Whittenhurst for £50 million in 2008 then spent another £50 million in building this, I think, 6-storey basement with parking for 25 cars, staff quarters, laundry, swimming pools, and such like. While the building work was going on, the merely wealthy were literally displaced. Kate Moss, always forget his name, Wham, George Michael, who all lived in houses around Whittenhurst, were flooded, were making complaints about all the traffic moving in and out. Victoria Wood, the late departed Victoria Wood, Terry Gilliam from Monty Python, the range of celebrities and architects and planners and politicians all trying to do something. What's interesting is that the planners and the politicians have had very little impact upon the power of plutocratic money to prevent these things from happening. Indeed, the ex-deputy mayor of London lives next door to an arts and crafts property that's been ripped down and replaced by a McMansion. So even people with state power, with knowledge, seem within this particular area of London and other parts of London to be relatively powerless against the power of plutocratic money. Real displacement, real change occurring within these areas. Here's very briefly an example of the kind of sort of de-specificity of housing. You know, it probably was Edwardian or Victorian or something at some point, but it's now been, the garden's been taken away, it's been expanded, and it's been made kind of modernist light, because then it becomes a liquid asset that can be sold very, very quickly, because you don't want all that Victorian stuff, because actually you won't be able to sell it very quickly. You want it to be a generic international type of... This is no longer about housing, it's no longer about belonging, it's about having a liquid asset. These are containers for money, and as we know from the Panama Papers, often money which has a dubious history. This is the Transparency International data that Private Eye put up. This is just for Highgate Village, showing that the land that's owned by overseas property investors and those using shell companies in order to purchase the properties. The end.
Thank you, Mark. Brilliant. Yeah. I think we still at least have 10 minutes. I mean, I cannot deny you from